Factories across Guangdong silent. Machines sitting idle. Workers lining up outside the gates waiting for jobs that no longer exist. A mountain of unsold goods stacking higher every day. The orders from America, the lifeline of these production lines, have vanished. Gone. Down by a crushing 80%. And yet Beijing claims everything is under control. But behind closed doors, something else is happening. Why is the world's so-called factory of the world choking on its own supply chains? Why are Chinese factories collapsing while Washington stands firm? 145% tariffs. A total blockade on exports to the US. The chain reaction is spreading fast. And Beijing? Quietly, silently, they're backing down, cutting tariffs on US goods while pretending they're not negotiating at all. The collapse didn't happen overnight, but when it hit like a hammer. In Shenzhen, Dongguan, across the Yangtze River Delta, the beating heart of China's export machine, factories began shutting down one after another. Plastic manufacturers, paper mills, packaging plants, entire production zones fell silent. Owners walked through the empty halls of their factories, staring at machines that once ran 24 hours a day. Now, they sit covered in dust. Second-hand equipment piling up in the alleys, waiting to be sold at scrap prices. But no one's buying. One factory owner in Dongguan whispered off the record, "There's no way out. Orders from the US are gone. Domestic sales can't cover the loss. We're burning cash just to keep the lights on." This is not a rumor. This is not speculation. This is what happens when 145% tariffs lock your biggest customer out of the game. Take the cardboard industry, the backbone of global shipping and logistics. US buyers once accounted for the lion's share of these orders. Yeah? Export contracts have dropped by 80%. Warehouses once full of outbound shipments now sit jammed with inventory that no one is allowed to take. Finished products stacking up like gravestones, marking the death of China's export dream. And the damage is not limited to one sector. The plastics industry, a pillar of China's manufacturing empire, is gasping for air. Propane dehydrogenation plants, designed specifically for cheap US raw materials, have been forced to cut production or shut down entirely. Ethane imports? Nearly wiped out. Costs have skyrocketed from $150 to over $330 per ton thanks to Beijing's own retaliatory tariffs of 125%. But here's the twist, they can't source these materials elsewhere. Not fast enough. Not cheap enough. This is the supply chain trap set by Trump, sprung by China's arrogance. Inside the factories, the consequences are brutal. Production lines running at half capacity. Shifts cut down from 8 hours to 4. Workers told to go home early if they're not laid off outright. Some return to their dormitories, others head back to the countryside, forced to abandon the jobs they once relied on to feed their families. A toy manufacturer in Guangdong put it bluntly, "If you depend on US orders, you're dead." And we all depended on US orders. This isn't just about a few unlucky companies. This is a chain reaction hitting small suppliers, middle-tier factories, and the big players alike. From electronics to textiles, from chemicals to consumer goods, the message is clear: when the American market shuts its doors, there is no plan B. Beijing tried to bluff their way through it. They called for internal circulation, pushing factories to sell into the domestic market instead. But the reality? Chinese consumers aren't buying. Wage growth has stalled. Youth unemployment is surging. Middle-class households are cutting back on spending, focusing on essentials like food and fuel. Luxury goods, electronics, even basic household items sales are plummeting. You can't replace the US market with a population that's tightening its belt. The numbers don't lie. In Beijing, retail sales dropped 9.9% in just one quarter. In Shanghai, the fall was even worse, 14.1%. These are the two wealthiest cities in China. If they're hurting this bad, imagine the rest of the country. This is not just an economic downturn. This is not just a slowdown. This is collapse. The factory of the world is breaking apart. Piece by piece. One shuttered plant at a time. And behind closed doors. Beijing knows it. But how did it come to this? Why can't China just switch suppliers, pivot to other markets, and walk away from the fight? Because this is not just a tariff war. This is a supply chain trap designed, engineered, and executed with surgical precision. Here's the hard truth. China's so-called factory of the world isn't built on independence. It's built on dependency. Locked into raw materials, equipment, and technologies that are overwhelmingly sourced from the United States. Especially in the high-stakes sectors like plastics, chemicals, electronics, and aerospace. The numbers expose it all. Over 90% of ethane used by China's biggest petrochemical firms comes directly from the United States. Not from Europe. Not from Russia. Not from the Middle East. From America. Ethane is the lifeblood of the plastic industry. Without it, there's no ethylene, no polypropylene, no polyethylene, no packaging, no toys, no auto parts. And switching to something else? Good luck. Beijing's factories were designed specifically to crack US ethane because it's cheaper, cleaner, and more efficient than alternatives like naphtha. Retooling these plants to handle different feedstocks would take years and cost billions. Most of them can't even physically make the switch without ripping out entire production lines. Satellite Petrochemical, China's largest private plastics player, built a fleet of 12 giant ethane tankers just to lock in their relationship with American exporters. You don't build the kind of infrastructure if you have options. They don't. They're trapped. And it's not just the plastics industry. The same choke points exist across China's high-tech supply chain. From advanced semiconductors to aircraft leasing, from medical equipment to specialty chemicals, America holds the keys. Xi Jinping's government slapped back with 125% retaliatory tariffs on these imports, trying to look tough for the cameras. But inside the Ministry of Commerce, sources quietly admitted they shot themselves in the foot. One Shenzhen import agent told Bloomberg off the record after they raised the tariffs, companies started begging the government for exemptions. They realized they couldn't survive without American ethane and chips. The irony? Beijing has already started quietly lifting these same tariffs, but they won't admit it. 8 categories of US semiconductors are now being waived. There's talk of ethane and medical equipment next. But the official line remains no negotiations. This is the illusion of strength. The theater of resistance. Behind the curtain? Panic. Why can't China just buy from somewhere else? Why not Europe or the Middle East? Because the ethane market is not like oil. Ethane transport requires ultra-cold shipping at -53 degrees Celsius. Only a handful of nations even have the infrastructure. The US dominates this space with massive export terminals and the largest fleet of ethane carriers on the planet. Norway? Barely a trickle. Less than 3,000 barrels a day, a drop in the ocean compared to China's demand. Even if Beijing wanted to pivot, it's locked in by long-term contracts, specialized tankers, and plants custom-built for American feedstock. Rip out the infrastructure, and you rip out the heart of the operation. The trap was set long before the first tariff was announced. Years of dependency. Decades of overconfidence. Trump didn't just raise tariffs. He closed the door. And Beijing walked right into it. The dream of rerouting supply chains through Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico? Washington saw it coming. Certificates of origin are now under tight scrutiny. Round-tripping schemes where Chinese goods sneak into America through third countries are being shut down. There's no back door left. No escape hatch. This wasn't a trade dispute. This was a chess move. And China never saw the checkmate coming. Step inside the ruins of what used to be China's proudest manufacturing zones, the Yangtze River Delta, the Pearl River Delta, the places that once powered the world's supply chains. What you'll find today is an industry. It's economic wreckage. In the toy capital of the world, Shantou, Guangdong, factory doors are chained shut. Urgent clearance, one banner reads, "Everything must go." Plastic toys, endoscopy kits, beauty packaging products, piled high in liquidation sales, dumped at prices so low they don't even cover production costs. Workers once assembling goods for Walmart, Target, and Amazon now stand idle or worse, forced back to rural villages with nothing but the clothes on their backs. One owner of a mid-sized plastics plant in Dongguan summed it up in brutal terms. "The American orders are gone. They were half my business. Domestic sales? Maybe 1/10 of that. I can't keep my people employed on 1/10. The chain reaction is devastating every link in the system. It starts with the big names, Satellite Petrochemical, Wanhua Chemical, slashing output by 40 to 50%, bleeding billions in lost profits. But the real slaughter happens downstream, where thousands of smaller suppliers can't absorb the hit. These companies aren't making headlines, but they're the ones feeding parts and raw materials to the giants. And when they go down, the entire ecosystem goes with them. There are now hundreds of second-hand injection molding machines flooding the Chinese resale market, equipment repossessed from shuttered plants. One trader in Shenzhen told Reuters, "I've got rows and rows of these machines, barely used. They're good quality, but nobody wants them. Everyone's either going bankrupt or holding on to their cash." And it's not just plastics. Look at the cardboard packaging sector, one of the simplest, most essential industries in global trade. Orders for export-grade cardboard have dropped by 80%. Factories that once ran nonstop are now shutting down at noon because there's nothing left to produce. Workers sent home early. Others laid off indefinitely. The American chokehold is cutting deep. And here's the irony. Beijing's official playbook was supposed to save them. The plan? Shift to domestic circulation. Sell to Chinese consumers instead of relying on exports. But that's not working. Not even close. Because the real problem isn't just lost exports. It's the brutal reality that Chinese domestic demand is too weak to pick up the slack. Middle-class families are tightening their budgets. Youth unemployment has soared to historic levels. Graduates flood the job market every summer. Over 12 million this year alone. But there are no jobs waiting for them. Factories aren't hiring. They're firing. A garment factory owner in Guangdong told Bloomberg, "For exports, I used to make about 20 yuan per piece. In the domestic market, I'm lucky if I get 2. And even then, the payments are late, returns are high, and the customers are fighting me on price. It's a bloodbath." The numbers tell the same story. Beijing's own statistics show retail sales collapsing in major cities. Down nearly 10% in Beijing. Over 14% in Shanghai. And these are supposed to be the strongest, most resilient consumer hubs in the entire country. If Beijing and Shanghai are hurting, what does that say about the smaller provinces? The countryside? The answer is obvious, they're barely hanging on. And the worst part? No one is talking about how bad it really is. Factory owners whisper their frustrations behind closed doors. Workers pack their bags and head home quietly, hoping to avoid attention. Beijing's state-run media focuses on grand summits and propaganda slogans, but the streets tell a different story. Empty shops, closed factories, growing lines at pawn shops and loan sharks. One business owner put it plainly, "You can't spin this with slogans. No matter how loud they shout about domestic circulation, people need jobs. People need orders. And right now, there are none. The collapse is real. And it's accelerating. Because this isn't just a downturn. It's a system failure, a choke point from which there may be no way out. Beijing thought it could ride out the storm. Thought it could pivot. Thought it could reroute the flow of trade through friendly nations, bypass the tariffs, and keep the engine running. But the doors are closing, one by one. And now there is no way out. The original plan from the top in Zhongnanhai was simple. Shift exports to Southeast Asia, Mexico, and even Europe. Repackage Chinese goods through these countries. Use creative paperwork, certificates of origin, transshipment hubs, to sneak products into the US market through backdoors. It worked for a while, but Washington saw it coming. Under Trump's orders, Customs and Border Protection began scrutinizing origin certificates, cracking down on round-tripping schemes where Chinese goods are disguised as Vietnamese or Mexican. New trade regulations forced suppliers to prove the true source of every screw, every chip, every plastic part. And when the investigations started, the back door slammed shut. A steel supplier in Vietnam, who spoke anonymously to Reuters, admitted, "Our clients from China were asking us to falsify documents. But after the US inspections got tighter, we stopped taking those orders. Too risky." This was never just about tariffs. It was about cutting off the escape routes. And the strategy worked. The so-called China Plus One model, the idea that companies could keep China as their main supplier but sprinkle in a few shipments from Thailand or Malaysia to skirt the tariffs, has collapsed. American corporations are now demanding full transparency, full traceability, from raw materials to finished product. The result? Chinese manufacturers can't hide behind third countries anymore. Their goods are getting blocked at the border. Their customers are walking away. But the supply chain choke isn't only about exports. It's about inputs too. Remember the ethane crisis? Beijing needs cheap US ethane to keep its plastics industry alive. The problem is, there's no replacement. Ethane transport requires specialized infrastructure, deep-cooled shipping, massive tankers, and terminal capacity that only the US and a handful of other countries can provide. Norway? Too small. Middle East? Too unstable. China's own domestic ethane production? A joke. Barely 120,000 tons per year. Not even enough to keep one major plant running at full capacity. Satellite Petrochemical and Wanhua Chemical, the giants of China's plastic sector, are stuck. Their factories were designed around U.S. ethane. Their ships are locked into American supply contracts. The tariffs that Beijing slapped on ethane imports, a defiant 125%, backfired almost immediately. The irony? Beijing is now quietly waiving these tariffs for some companies behind closed doors. But they can't admit it publicly. The narrative of strong resistance must be maintained, even as the system crumbles from within. Insiders at the Ministry of Commerce leaked that a list of 131 product categories is under review for exemption, including ethane, semiconductors, aircraft leasing, and medical equipment. These aren't luxuries. These are survival goods. But publicly, the government denies any negotiations are taking place. This is the reality behind the headlines. Beijing talks tough, but the factories are starving for raw materials. The global doors are closing. The lifelines are being cut off. And the world is moving on. Look at Wall Street. Major investment funds are pulling out of China quietly. New capital is flowing into India, Vietnam, Mexico, anywhere but the mainland. Goldman Sachs projects that without significant policy change, China's GDP could plummet to below 1% growth this year. Zero growth for the world's second-largest economy. That's not just a slowdown. That's collapse. And there's no bailout big enough to plug the hole. Beijing tried subsidies. Threw money at the problem. But subsidies can't create demand where none exists. They can't replace the American consumer. They can't rebuild broken trust. One senior executive at a global logistics firm put it bluntly: when your largest market walks away, and your suppliers can't function without foreign raw materials, you're done. That's game over. The chain reaction is now global. From empty factories in Shenzhen, to idle ships at the ports of Guangdong, to Wall Street investors quietly cutting their China exposure. The message is clear. Beijing is boxed in. The trap is locked. And the world isn't waiting. The so-called factory of the world is bleeding out. From plastic plants to packaging lines, from the biggest petrochemical giants to the smallest suppliers, China's export machine is collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. Trump didn't need to fire a single shot. He closed the door, locked the supply chain, and Beijing quietly bowed its head, cutting tariffs behind closed doors just to keep the lights on. But here's the question. Is this just a temporary retreat, or the first crack in the Great Wall of China's economic dominance? The chain reaction has begun. The choke points are sealed. How far will Beijing go to hide the damage? Let me know your thoughts below. And stay tuned, the next move could change everything.